Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. In this episode, I talked to La Percée du Bocage Museum President Billy Leblond and Men in the Shed blogger Colin Foster. We talk about Operation Bluecoat, one of the most pivotal yet little-known offensives of World War II following the Normandy invasion. We also talk about Colin Foster's project, Men in the Shed. Colin has been a regular visitor to Normandy since 2002, when he started researching the Normandy campaign. As a result of his friend stumbling upon the names, ranks, serial numbers, and date of capture of 18 Allied POW soldiers written on the inside wall of his shed. Thus was born Colin Foster's blog, Men in the Shed. For the past 5 years, Billy Leblond has been involved in preserving the history of Operation Bluecoat and currently serves as the president of the board of directors of La Percée du Bocage Museum. P.S. I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong. Billy gives credit to museum founder Jean Menard for helping him to understand the human aspect of the battles and people impacted by the war in Normandy. Billy Leblond and Colin Foster, welcome and thank you for being here today.
No problem.
We're going to just get right off into this history that I know very little about. So we're going to ask you, Colin, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
It's the Second World War, the fighting in Normandy, particularly a relatively unknown operation called Operation Bluecoat, and some of the peripheral things that I fell across because of a friend living in Normandy, which ties very neatly back to the operation and also to the museum where Billy's president.
Billy, you reached out to me and you were excited about sharing this history with us on Armchair Historians. Tell us a little bit about your museum and your passion for this story.
So, since last year, I'm a president of the museum. I'm there since 5 years ago. And the museum, it's a small museum in Normandy, a little less known than the others, but that is really unique because it speaks about what happened to the men during Operation Bluecoat. Much more than the operation, we speak about what happened to each of them, even if they die, and that's one of the most important things, remember the dead. And that's also what has started the museum, because at first, Jean Menard, when he created it, was looking for the people who has liberated the city, but also what happened to the people who have died around the city. With some school comrades, he kept the grave forward. And he kept all the name of the guy who have died around summertime inside a small book. And when he became much older, he have tried to find the veteran, and he have came to VIII and met them and showed them the book. And one of them was really emotional by seeing the name of his comrade who was killed when he was wounded. And it's starting that Jean Menard started a temporary exposition and after a museum, where he explains the story of the men who fought during Operation Bluecoat.
And what's the name of the museum again?
So the name of the museum is La Percée du Bocage, so the Bocage breakout.
Picking up on a couple of things that Billy mentioned there, unlike some of the museums in Normandy, which are very much all about, they've got tanks outside and they're very much focused on the fighting, as in just focus on the fighting.
Sure.
The thing that I really like about the museum at Saint-Martin is, yes, it's about the fighting, obviously, because without the fighting, one could argue there'd be no reason to have a museum. But in addition to information about the fighting and some of the units that fought there, there is an awful lot of information about the impact that the fighting had on the general population of the area, and also the impact that it had on the soldiers themselves as they were fighting through the area. So it's very much the story of people rather than simply the story of tanks, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's great. Brilliant. So tell us, set it up, the Operation Bluecoat. Who were these men? What was their mission? And how did that play out? And as you said, how did it impact the people?
Basically, the Allies had come ashore on the 6th of June and then got into a slogging match with the Germans. And for several weeks, there didn't seem to be a great deal of movement. The Allies were slowly pushing forward. They'd had a couple of operations where they would push forward. The Germans then counterattacked. And on the eastern side, or the left-hand side of the armies, which was the British and the Canadians, which sort of was from effectively Vire across to Caen, the majority of the German armoured divisions that were in Normandy were being attracted there. And the reason why they were attracted there is beyond Caen and Falaise is basically open countryside, or relatively open countryside. And so the Germans' view was they needed to stop any breakout from there because it went into what was called good tank country, and that would then give the breakout to Paris and further through. So the Germans were very much intent on stopping the British breaking out. On the American side, there was still obviously fighting very hard, but initially the Americans were interested in capturing the port of Cherbourg so they could start trying ferry supplies instead of everything coming over the beaches. But then they then needed to take Saint-Lô, which took a lot of fighting, a lot of casualties, but eventually got Saint-Lô. And then the idea was that the Americans would punch with a right hook, and the British would still be in place holding the Germans on their front.
How did you do that? That's amazing.
Magic.
It is magic. Thank you. I didn't even know I could do that.
Okay, so looking at the map, on the right-hand side, we've got where the British and most of the German armour is around Caen and that area. And on the left-hand side, we've got where the Americans are trying to push through. The problem was that there's a very large, I'm not going to call it a mountain, it's a very large hill called Mont Pinçon. And Billy will correct me on the spelling of that, where the Germans was behind the German lines, and they could actually look across to the American lines and arrange for bombardments, artillery bombardments. And as the Americans broke through, they felt that they had an exposed left flank and so needed some support, some help with that. The British started an operation very, very short notice called Operation Bluecoat, which was to come down on the left flank of the Americans to effectively sort of keep the Germans away from the Americans. And its main objective was to take Mont Pinçon. However, that in some respects went wrong, because the fighting to take Mont Pinçon was through very, very dense countryside. So narrow lanes, sunken lanes with big earth banks and trees and bushes growing out of them. So ideal defensive country. However, the British on their right flank, they actually found a way through a forest and through between two German armies. And they're always sort of points of weakness, because the one side thinks that their colleagues are looking after maybe a road, and the other army thinks that they are looking after the road. And as it turned out, there's this bridge over the River Soulèvre that nobody was watching. And the British got there, the reconnaissance units got there, radioed back the general in charge of 11th Armoured Division that was sort of spearheading this push, recognised the opportunity, pushed his troops down there, and basically forced a gap between two German armies or army groups. And that then expanded and flooded through. The first village, or first village, town, however you want to describe it, that was actually liberated as part of that process, or the first large one, was Saint-Martin-de-Bessas, which is why the museum is based there. This operation, eventually Mont Pinçon was also taken, and it became quite a really effective operation. And the reason why in some ways it's not very well known is in his memoirs after the war, Field Marshal Montgomery hardly mentions it. He sort of gives it 2 or 3 lines, and then he goes off talking about something else, because Montgomery was very much a general who liked to properly plan his operations, and this Bluecoat just took a life of its own.
That's interesting. And so it does seem to be one of those pivotal moments in the war. From what you said, and one of the lucky breaks, of which there were many, I think, throughout the war. I mean, especially at the end, it seems like. So that's really interesting. Yeah. And yet, how pivotal, let me ask you this, how pivotal do you think that moment was?
It broke through the German lines. It threatened one of their main east-west supply routes, because sort of just after the Operation Bluecoat started on the 30th of July 1944. On, I think it was the 7th of August, the Germans, in response to what Hitler asked, mounted a counterattack at the American breakthrough. And their idea was to get through to the sea at, my brain says Avranches, but I think it was Avranches, wasn't it, Billy? Where the Germans were trying to break through. But they were stopped by the Americans. But part of the challenge that they had was they were sending these armoured divisions towards the sea, but then they've got the British coming down on their flank. So they've got to divert some of their armour, instead of it going to punch a hole through the Americans and cut off Patton and his Third Army, who by this point had gone past the point they're aiming for. They've lost 2 armoured divisions who are trying to stop the British in the form of 11th Armoured Division, in form of Guards Armoured Division, 3rd Infantry Division, 15th Scottish Division, 7th Armoured Division. So there's the whole British, and the Germans sort of going, oh, heck, they're coming there, we've got to stop them, which also then reduced the forces they could send against the Americans. So in some, and that then started, that was the beginnings of what became known as the Falaise Pocket, because the Germans had pushed so far in, Patton and his Third Army swung round, and it then formed a pocket that then ended up sort of, to all intents and purposes, destroying the German army in Normandy.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's amazing.
So it really is a pivotal operation. And it's General Roberts, Pip Roberts, who was the the officer commanding 11th Army Division. It was the third big operation they had been involved in. And he said in his autobiography, it took us 3 operations to get things right, actually working, because they came in end of June, rings a bell. And their first couple of battles they were involved in, he was overruled as to how they could operate. And they were sort of following sort of standard doctrine at the time. And it was only after the second operation, Operation Goodwood, that they went, hang on a moment, we're going into areas which are really, we need to separate, rather than having the infantry and the tanks as 2 separate units, we need to mix them up. And effectively using the way the German tactics worked, using those against them. And so I say the operation was a success. So that's Operation Bluecoat, which is what the museum focuses on. And I say,
can I just ask, Billy, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
No, Colin, I've done a pretty good description of the battle here.
Yeah, he did. I think I even understand it a little bit.
The map that Billy was sharing, that's a project that the Canadians have started. I think, again, it's all volunteers, isn't it, Billy? And what it does is it started with just looking at Canadian units, and it now looks at many more units, and it shows day by day how the units moved during the certainly the Battle of Normandy. It's a brilliant resource.
What's the name of the website?
So is it project44.ca?
Yes, that's it. And also, what's really interesting, you have all the entry of the war area, so you know what they have done each day.
That's nice. So I'll link out to that in the episode notes. That sounds like an amazing resource.
Yeah. It really is, because you can actually see how the units are moving, because what they've done is they've looked at the war diaries of each of the units. So each unit kept what was called a war diary, which recorded, in simple terms, what the day was, where they were, and what they did. In some cases, it's just nothing to report. And then you'll have 3 pages covering just one battle, for example. So it's great because it's actually followed, and some of them have got grid references, so they've worked out the grid references, because part of the issue you have nowadays is the grid references that are used on French maps now are a different numbering system to what they were on the maps that were used or that were created during the war. What's really frustrating is that the French, what were called the French Série Bleue, like 1 to 25,000 maps, they used to have the old numbering system on as well. So a lot of my maps, I've got pencil lines across because I've drawn the old grids on. On the very latest versions, they don't seem to have those on, which is really annoying.
Interesting. What I'm really interested in now is what you were alluded to, Colin, is the people and how this affected them. Who were these men? Who were the civilians that were impacted by this operation?
The simple answer is everyone who was living in the area, because how the British Army liberated France was basically by blowing it up. All of the advances were supported by either aerial bombardments, so bombers coming over, fighter bombers dropping bombs, firing rockets, firing cannon shells, and then artillery shells and all that. So basically, if you lived in the way of the British Army or the American Army, then and you were a civilian, then you were likely to suffer in one way or another. And of course, this was the first time that certainly the French in Normandy had suffered in this way, because there was no fight, or very little fighting, I think, during the early part of the war in 1940, because the French government at the time sort of came to surrender an armistice before the whole country was involved in fighting. And so it was more of a, I won't say peaceful occupation, but it was an occupation rather than a fought for or fought over land. It was the Germans came in and occupied. So with the British coming in, and certainly there was great concern on behalf of the British and the Americans as to French casualties. And I think it was de Gaulle who was leader of the Free French forces and who, of course, became president of France, who I think said, forgive me for the accuracy of the numbers, but it was something like, there could be between 10 or 20,000 French people killed as a result of the fighting. And de Gaulle actually said 20,000 French people killed for the liberation of our country is a very small price to pay. Now, if you were on the receiving end of that, you may have different views, of course. But I think that was the gist. He knew the Germans wouldn't just walk away and leave it. There would be a lot of fighting. But he recognised that because of that, there was going to be some civilian casualties. And although it was attempted to minimise those, the Allies would drop leaflets telling people that the town was going to be, was in the way of an advance and therefore they needed to think about moving or whatever. And in some cases, the Germans actually moved them away from the front line. They literally moved because their perception was that the French would be on the Allies' side. They would actually clear them sort of 2-3 kilometres away from the front line so they knew there wouldn't be anyone spying on them and able to get information back maybe to the Allies. So there was a lot of dislocation in terms of physically being moved out of your houses. There was, and I think that happened to Jean Menard, didn't it, if memory serves. There was lots of dislocation in that, when they could come back, maybe the house was destroyed, either sort of completely or just or partially. In fact, I remember a veteran that I knew, he sadly passed away, Muir Findlay, who you'll be aware of, Billy, because he was one of the Scots Guardsmen, who on one of his return visits to France during the one battle, they thought the Germans were in this one house, so they actually fired shells from their tank at this house and sort of basically got rid of the Germans. And he went back on one of his visits. They found the house because he got a photograph, and he went, and the family that were there, I think it was a younger generation, but it was the same family living there.
Oh, wow. And
he apologised for the damage that he had done for the house. And they just went, that's not a problem.
Thank you.
We are now here free. Yeah. Don't worry about it. That can be repaired.
That gave me the chills. My mother, like I said about my mom, she was born in Belgium. Her family was just 25 years earlier executed by the Germans in World War I. They called it the Rape of Belgium. And so when the Germans were coming through again, my mother's 8 years old, they're freaking out. And so they flee. They end up in France. They end up in a town called La Roche-sur-Yon. It ended up being a military base for the Germans. And so it's interesting hearing this other side of the war. From my perspective, hearing Mom's side, who sadly she passed away in 2017. I'm working on a documentary. It's called The Last Train Leaving Belgium. It's really about her experience as a child in World War II and fleeing Belgium. And then they end up going south and they end up in Condalier. And then, of course, they end up being occupied by the Germans anyways. These stories that she would tell me, I don't think people realize kind of the gray areas of war. And having my mother's stories, like at one point the Germans were retreating, the Allies were coming in, and it was a very tense moment for the town that she was in. I love getting the bigger picture of what was going on, and this is one really good example about what effort was put in to clearing out the Germans.
You hit on a really good point there, that in more modern times, and especially if you're not if you don't study the history to a depth, there is a gross oversimplification that tends to be made that the Germans were all Nazis and bad guys, and the Brits and the Americans were all the good guys. And the Brits and the Americans never did anything dodgy, and the Germans were atrocious. And that's just simply not the case. There were really good guys on both sides, and there were really dodgy things that happened on both sides. But of course, it's the victors that get to write the history books. I remember many years ago, because I also do tabletop wargaming, so we play with little model tanks and that. And I'd just been reading a book about the Canadians, and I was at a wargaming show, and there was some. I was stood in a queue, and these guys dressed as Germans walked past, and this person in the queue sort of went, they shouldn't be allowed here, sort of marching around like that, it's just totally wrong. And I said, well, to be fair, I said, if there weren't them, then, it takes two to tango. You have to have both sides in. Yes, but all the atrocities they did, and he sort of went off on a right rant. And because I'd just been reading this one book, there was a guy who was dressed as a reenactor, as a Canadian from a certain unit. And I said, can I ask you a question? I said, you're really objecting to those guys? And he said, yeah. And I says, because of all the bad things they did. Yeah. I said, okay. I says, are you happy that guy being there? And he went, well, yeah, of course, he's dressed as a Canadian. He says, of course, I don't have a problem with that at all. I said, interestingly, I says, because I've just finished reading the book. I says, and I'm fairly sure that he's from a unit that were an armoured unit, and what they did was they got some German prisoners and fastened them to the front of their tanks as they were advancing. I says, and their logic was that a German with an anti-tank gun or handheld anti-tank weapon would just maybe think, not react immediately because they'd seen it, and would give them the opportunity of firing first. I said, so if you're unhappy with them, I said, then you should also think, I said, because at the end of the day, war is a very, very, very ugly thing. Fortunately, I've never experienced it, faced it, I've never served in the military, anything like that, but I've read a lot. And the problem is you have the very superficial, the Germans are the bad guys and everybody else is good.
Well, I think that you raise a good point. My mother, one of the stories that my mother used to tell, and this is in the documentary, I believe she's telling the story in front of the patisserie where this happened. Her and her brother was, I want to say 5 years younger than her. This is in La Roche-sur-Yon. They're at the pastry shop and they're looking in the window, dreaming about the pastries. Their mouths are watering. And like I said, this becomes a German military base. And she says that a German soldier comes up and looks at them, goes into the patisserie, and then comes out and he's bought them each a pastry. And that really helped to kind of bust through my idea of black and white, good and bad. And what my mother always said was there was a difference between the German soldiers and the SS. And that's how she understood it. And that's how she saw it manifest. And, so I think it is important to talk about, the German soldiers who were just young guys who had to do what they had to do and had a conscience about it. I think there was that, and we don't hear those stories a lot.
There used to be, again, sadly passed away, a guy called Erich Bissois who fought with the 12th SS, the Hitler Jugend. Yeah, he fought with them, but after or subsequently, and certainly in more recent years till he sadly passed away, he dedicated his life to reconciliation, and especially reconciliation between old adversaries. I knew a British veteran guy called Albert Figg, who has been very heavily. Are you aware of Albert, Billy Hill 112 by Com? Okay, so he's put lots of memorials there, and he would, if you mentioned the SS to Albert, he would just go off on one because he was really. And I was there on the day that he was introduced to Eric. And through translator, Eric explained what he was trying to do, which actually about reconciliation and education, making sure people don't forget what happened, which actually was what Albert was on about. And I remember being there, they're on top of this bare hill, clasping each other's hands, where they both fought over, clasping each other's hands, and both of them in tears.
That's amazing.
I feel privileged to have witnessed that. So I think, again, as we say, it's not just black and white. It's not even black and white, I don't think, between the German, what was called the German Heer, the ordinary German army, and the SS. I think, again, there were issues with both, because in some ways I suspect part of it, okay, indoctrinate, but also just how much stress you're under, and sometimes what situation you're in, because if you're advancing and you've suddenly captured some prisoners of war, what do you do with them? And okay, they should be escorted to the back, but if you've got a unit of sort of 30 men that's been shot to pieces or whatever, so you've got maybe a dozen left, and these guys have been shooting at you, and then the ammunition's run out and they've put the hands up. Unless you've actually experienced that firsthand, you have no idea how you would be in that circumstance, I think.
Yeah, that's what I keep coming back to, is I don't know what I would do in any of these given circumstances. Yeah. My cousin's mother was a courier for the underground in Belgium, and she worked also for the Census Bureau. And what ended up happening is that, she was really trying to help, like farmers, for example. She would say, okay, I'm going to tell them you have 4 cows when in fact you have 10 cows. She ended up being basically persecuted by her own people because they saw her as a collaborator. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Colin. You just don't know until you're in that situation. My family survived it, and I'm here to tell the story. Yeah. So I don't know what to say about that, but I'm grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why it's so important, and the museum do a great job at this, of engaging with veterans who are sort of visiting their old stomping ground, shall we say, and being able to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. To listen to their stories, to record their stories, and then to share those stories with people. That's vitally important.
Even though this was in the 40s, there's more to be revealed. There's always more to be revealed. More stories, more nuance. And, we only have some of the information.
Yeah.
So, that's why I'm grateful you're here telling me this story. So tell us about the people.
As in the Men in the Shed people?
Yeah, I'd like to know about the Men in the Shed. Tell us about your blog and that type of thing.
So, friend of mine moved out into Normandy in 2000. And we'd go on the phone. The conversation would at some point go, oh, and you really need to come out to Normandy. Why? Because you need to have a look at our shed, because I know you'll enjoy our shed. So eventually, I think it was in 2002, I persuaded my wife and my 2 kids, right, we're going to Normandy to see Stuart and Barry. So we arrived in their little village, and basically the reason why there's then the direct link with the museum, apart from the fact it's telling the story of people, and that's what I'm trying to do with my blog as well, but actually the village where my friend lived, Saint-Vigor-de-Mézeray, is within the operational area of Operation Bluecoat. So it's sort of, and in fact, the units that liberated the village were involved in Operation Bluecoat. So there was a direct link to Bluecoat there. So we went over and sort of, arrived at my friend's. Where my friend lived used to be, a number of years ago, or a number of years before he took it over, it used to be the village bakery. And in the back garden was the grain store, so where they used to store flour and all the bits to make bread. So we sort of dropped our bags and everything. I said, "Okay, Stuart, so what's this about this shed?" He went, "There's the shed." So we sort of went up and he said, those patches there, those are patched up bullet holes. And I went, "Well, yeah, that doesn't surprise me because there was an awful lot of fighting round here, the odd bullet hole, And it's all go inside." So I opened the door, went inside and, "Okay, Stuart, it's a wooden shed full of junk." He said, "Well, turn round." And I turned round and I just went, "What do you know about that? What do you know about them?" And he went, "Nothing." And there's this panel on the, as you go in on the left-hand side, it's about 6 strips of, like, planks of wood across, and there are 18 names on there. 2 American pilots, 2 American paratroopers, an RAF pilot who turned out to be American, and then 13 British infantry. And basically what happened was, as they were being caught in or taken as prisoner of war during the fighting, either with the pilots when they were shot down, or as they were captured, as the Germans moved them back through their lines, they would eventually end up at the village of Saint-Vigor. And so it was guys, right, well, 6 o'clock now, we're not going to go any further. Let's shove them in there, lock the door. That way we've only got to leave one chap outside guarding them. And so it was just used as an overnight lockup.
So your friend didn't know that?
No, he had no idea. He just saw these names.
Wow.
So
that's a wow.
Subsequently, what we've been able to do through visiting the National Archives in the UK, we've been able to track some of them down. We found some of them after the war. They would fill in what's called a returning prisoner of war questionnaire, which they've put information on. Some of them we've got photographs. Some of them we've been really lucky and been able to connect with family members. We've had the son and grandson of one of the American paratroopers has visited. One of the daughters of the RAF pilot has visited. And one of the daughters of... Hang on, let's get this right. Son and grandson of one of the American paratroopers, daughter, or one of the daughters of the RAF pilot, and one of the daughters of one of the American pilots have all visited the ship. They've come over to Normandy on a trip. We've then taken them round. So with the daughter of the RAF pilot, we know where he crashed his aircraft. So we've taken them there to the crash site. The farmer on whose land it is had arranged his friend to turn up with a metal detector, and she found a couple of pieces of aluminium that were caked in dirt. So it was obviously not just put there to make to make it look like there was genuine full of dirt and crap and whatever. And it was obviously a piece of aluminium. Where you're going to get aluminium in the middle of a field? Well, it ain't going to come from a farm truck. So it's fairly reasonable to presume that it's from his Spitfire. With the daughter of the American pilot, we're able to take her to the airfield that he took off from on his last mission, because you can still see where that is in the French countryside. We found where he crashed, so we found that place and spoke to someone who knows someone who was able to explain where it was because she saw the aircraft still in the field. Taken to where he was held as a prisoner, first of all, where then 4 escaped from, to then a village where they had some help from the French underground, and then back to the shed. But the real icing on the cake on that one was, through my research, another French gentleman, Jean-Claude Ferrand, used to run an independent, unofficial website for the village. And through one of his friends, they were able to track down the son of the baker that was there during the Second World War. I mean, again, unfortunately, he sadly passed away. But on the sort of second day of our trip, we said, well, we'll take you now to the shed so you can have a look at the shed. We took her there, and there were some of the members of the local committee were there, the local council. There was this gentleman sort of stood back a little bit, and I said, just need to introduce you to Gilbert. And she said, hello, and what are you to do with the village? I said, well, what he's to do with the village? I says, when your dad was a prisoner of war in there, he was 9.
Wow.
Because his dad was the village base, and it was like you could have heard a pin drop.
Yeah,
it was just sort of,
sure.
Here was a real connection to the past. I mean, it was just sort of
right.
And he was able to describe her dad, and she went, it was. But he then told us, we talked about, sort of the people, and this is something with the story. He told us that what his father used to do. And he won't have been the only one that would have done this, but it's just that. So now he would because they used to have an outdoor toilet in the back garden, and so he would wait until one of the prisoners had been allowed to go to the toilet by the German guard. He would then put his jacket on, storm outside, open the door to the toilet. It was locked. Turn to the German, shout at the German, how dare he let these prisoners use his toilet when he wanted to use the toilet. And the German guard would start laughing, thinking, just some mad Frenchman, would turn away, and then he would go. Don't know whether that came through, but that's 3 dots, which is the Morse code for V for victory. So the person using the loo knew that the person on the outside was on his side. And as the door opened and the prisoner came out, the baker would be shouting at him, how dare he use his toilet? He wanted to use the toilet, whatever. And at the same time, opening his jacket and passing him some bread. Now, that, if it had been caught, who knows what would have happened. But that sort of connection and that what people were prepared to, French people were prepared to do to help, maybe not in a sort of totally extrovert way. I remember I think his report to all the generals immediately after the war by General Eisenhower, I think he actually said something like, if all of the French people who claimed to be part of the resistance and the French forces of the interior, if they'd actually all been available right at the start, he'd have had another 2 divisions. And sort of he sort of effectively making the comment that some people were sort of, well, no, it was safe to come out. We'll say, we're part of the resistance and whatever. But there were some real people who were really risking their lives to help people. And to have that real connection there then, as Gilbert is explaining this story in French, it's been translated. Do you know, Billy, Jean-Marc Lezuet? And I've probably pronounced his surname badly. But he's a historian. He was there helping with translations. And he's translating it into English. And it's just sort of, those sort of stories, and that being related not just to me as an amateur historian, but being related to one of the daughters of one of the guys that benefited from this, was just sort of, you're talking about goosebumps and hairs on the back of the neck, and that's why why I'm passionate about the research I'm doing, but also why I'm also so passionate about the museum at Saint Martin, because that's the story that they're wanting to tell as well, the story of the people.
Right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when did you start researching this?
2002.
What year was
2002?
Okay.
Or 2002 went out to France. 2003 was when I actually started my first bit of digging, shall we say.
Okay. And so you and your friend...
Yeah, Glenn.
When did you start the blog?
A few years ago.
Okay, because there's a lot of information.
Oh, there is.
Yeah.
We're actually just going through a process because we've got an awful lot of information that isn't even up on there. And whether it's sort of records of recent trips we've been on, or just things that we've found out that we've just not got round to put it up on there. So at the moment, we're actually starting to go through a whole refresh of all of the information that we've got.
That is a labor of love, and I thank you for doing the research. So how did you connect with the museum with Billy? Okay,
so again, that goes back a number of years when we first went over to France. Barry and Stuart said, you need to go and have a look at this little museum. It's a lovely little museum. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And at the time, the president of the museum was an Englishman, a guy called David Mabbott. When he became the curator there, knew absolutely nothing about the operation. I think he knew a little bit, and sort of totally embraced it and got really interested in it. And he was always wanting to connect people, always wanted to put people in touch with people.
Nice.
He then returned back to the UK. And there was then a period where, and I have to be careful. No, I don't. I'll be my normal self. Where the person running the museum saw it as, the way I describe it, saw it as a job. So they turned up, they opened the door. If people came in, they gave them a leaflet, and that was it.
Yeah, I understand.
Being blunt, the guy just wasn't interested. We then heard through David, there was this new mad bloke that had got involved. It was a bit of he was a journalist, so it was a bit odd. So we went over the following June and met a guy called Mark Kentell. Mark is Scottish. He lives in the area, and he just was getting really annoyed at the fact you got this museum that was telling the story of the area that was just being allowed, I'll use a phrase, to rot away. And he was like, hang on, this is your history, folks. Something needs to be done.
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose, in common with everything that happens the world over, everyone stepped back, and he was sort of, oh, okay, so I'd better do something about it then. If I'm shooting my mouth off, I'd better do something about it. So he became the next president of the museum. Glyn and I were over there and chatting to Mark, introduced ourselves. He was explaining some of the ideas he got, where he wanted to take the museum. Because of his enthusiasm and his drive, Jean Menard, who was the founder of the museum, who I think had almost got to the point where he was almost prepared to take his artifacts that he had collected back away from the museum. And bearing in mind that when he set the museum now sits on land that used to belong to Jean Menard, so that's the involvement that he's had in it. He was ready to take stuff away. But Mark's drive, enthusiasm, interest just sparked something in Jean Menard again.
Oh, good.
So he was then starting to be back involved. We decided to do something Glyn and I are very good at when we're in France, which is going to a bar tabac and have something to drink. And we took Mark with us to sort of start having a bit of a chat. Mark goes on his phone, and a couple of minutes later, this very fresh-faced person who looked far too young to be able to drink appeared. And that was Billy, who at the time had just started, I think this is right, and Billy, you can correct me, had just started showing some interest in the museum, but was sort of not quite sure how involved to get. And I think got caught up in Mark's enthusiasm, to be perfectly honest, and started getting involved in the museum. Mark, he was looking at coming back to Scotland. So it was then a case of, right, well, if I'm going, who's going to be the new president of the museum? Billy then became museum president. Mark is still in France, which is great. And he's now the museum secretary. But of course, because of Billy's age, being younger and therefore very familiar with social media and all of that sort of side, Mark, because he's a journalist and therefore he's well aware of how to get articles in the press and all of that, means that the museum itself, I think last year, despite COVID, I think you had some of the best visitor numbers.
Oh, wow.
Certainly in the period before the museum had to shut. I think that I'm right, aren't I, Billy, that last year was had COVID not happened, if things had carried on as they had started, it would have been your best year ever.
Yes, if we see at Liberation Festival we organize each year, it was the best year we ever done. For the visitor part, as we have 50% of visitors who came from England, it was less important for us. But yes, we were starting a really great year if he hasn't happened to have COVID.
Yeah. So, as a team, they work really, really well together. And
is this a volunteer position or is this a paid position?
A volunteer position.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And it says a lot about the management at this point.
Yeah.
So I live in a town. We're a National Historic Landmark District. For such a small town, we have quite a few museums. And there's a huge difference the way that the museums are received. And I won't name who they are, but one particular museum I think of, the guy who is the executive director is so passionate about telling the story that it's infectious. The passion is infectious. And it sounds like that's what you've thankfully stumbled on again at the museum.
Absolutely. And it's because of that why I'm also passionate about the museum. One of the issues is that they compete against all the museums along the beaches, because a lot of people think that how the Germans were beaten was you had one day, which was 6th of June. You then probably had Market Garden. If you're Americans, you're probably aware of the Battle of the Bulge, and then it was all over. The Normandy campaign went on from 6th of June until the end of August. And people forget that. And so a lot of the museums on the beaches, that's what people see. They don't see the inside. And again, with a lot of them, there's lots of money being thrown at them, lots of paid staff, and it's a different experience. Both the La Percée Museum and also the one at Tissot, which is run on exactly the same basis. It's in a little small church. It's very much about the people, the impact of war. It's a lovely little museum, and some of the things they've got there, a lot of the artifacts have been donated by people who fought to liberate the village.
Each of them have a story behind the man who owned it or its family. So we can have an explanation about each object, almost.
Okay, so Billy, why this passion? Why this history?
I think it all started with my grandfather, who, when I was younger, taught me about history, what happened in ancient time in our area. Later at college, I was interested in World War II. Finally, when I start my study, I'm thinking of becoming working in a museum. one day I have the opportunity to do a project about a museum. I became really interested about this museum, and it was the Museum of Saint Martin. On this project, it was when Mark started to relaunch the museum, and it was a project to relaunch the museum, what we have to do to make it work after that. So just after that, I've contacted the president before Mark, Didier Duchemin, and he explained to me how it worked. I have different encounters. And that when, after doing this project, I've tried to be a member of the museum and open it during the summer. And after all of that, and also because I have my family who was really kind to explain to me about what happened to them. For example, my grandmother, during the war, she saw the crash of a Canadian pilot in her field, in the backyard. So all of this story behind, I was really interested about what happened in her area. And it's really when I started to work at the museum and met Jean Ménard that I really wanted to explain to people what happened there and the men who fought in our area, and also the human connection with the family and know what happened to them. And you have a lot of commemoration who have happened in our area. For example, my family had a veteran who came in for approximately 10 years for the commemoration, and it were our host, and they have become great friends when he was still alive. So it's all of the story behind that drive my interest in the museum and World War II history.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your passion and that you're committed to telling these different stories. Now, how do you become a member of the museum?
Yes, we have members that pay €5 to be a member of the museum since this year, and they can be there to welcome the people who want to know more about Operation Bluecoat, about the men who fought there.
And I think that's there's a form, I think, downloadable from the website where you can actually become a member.
Okay, good. I'll link out to that too. How far away is the shed from the museum?
25 miles. That's a bit further than I thought. Okay.
So those are two separate stories.
Yeah. They're connected. They're connected in that the area that the shed was part of Operation Bluecoat, and the village was liberated by one of the divisions that was involved in Operation Bluecoat. The guys who we are researching had been captured before Operation Bluecoat started. So they weren't prisoners as a result of Operation Bluecoat. Yeah. It was just a really nice connection between this story, which is the story of people, and the story the museum tells, which is the story of people, both in war.
Do we see these histories in pop culture anywhere?
Sort of. In that I keep being asked by several people, when am I writing my book about the men in the shed?
That's a fascinating story.
Keep being nudged about that, and eventually there will be a book there.
I have to say this, I could totally see connected short stories about the narratives and the information you've learned about the different characters.
Operation Bluecoat, there are some very good books about already, ranging from Pip Roberts, the General of the 11th Armoured Division. It's covered in his autobiography. There are also a guy called Ian Dalglish, who's written a couple of books. There is actually a fictional book called Battle, which is set in Operation Bluecoat, and it's sort of set effectively. Those were the Americans, those were the Brits, and it was sort of like that. But there's a fictional account of a battle which is based in Operation Bluecoat, which sort of fits there. I think it's called Battle. I think it's by the name Kenneth Maxey rings a bell, but I've got a copy of it downstairs.
Okay. Maybe you guys could send me a list and I'll link out to the books.
Yeah. So this is a book I've written,
Oh, nice.
And this is about the very first part of Operation Bluecoat,
Okay.
which was kicked off by what was called 6th Guards Tank Brigade and 15th Scottish Infantry Division. Their objective was to sort of break through, or to try and break through the German lines, so that the armoured divisions, 11th Armoured Division, Guards Armoured Division that I mentioned, could actually then exploit that. One of the composite units of 6th Guards Tank Brigade was 3rd Battalion Scots Guards, and I now know another couple of people that fought with them, but I knew a veteran of that battle, and when I discussed it with him, he was used to say, "Oh, I never talk about it," because in their first day of action, their first battle, they lost 24 men killed, 19 men wounded, and 11 tanks destroyed because they got ambushed. But the battalion, the other two parts of the battalion held the ground, and that formed a strong shoulder to sort of keep the Germans away, so that 11th Armoured Division and Guards Armoured Division could break through. And in 2019, which was the 75th anniversary of the battle, again, through work that I had done, through work that Billy and the museum had done, we unveiled a new and a significantly large memorial. I'm 6 foot tall, and this memorial comes up to about there on me.
Wow.
It's in the form of 2 pages of a book opened. You can see it on the back of the book there.
Okay, yeah.
And that records the names of all those that were killed in that battle on the first day. We had about between 60 and 65 family members of guys who either fought through the war, or fought and were killed on that hill from 3rd Battalion Scots Guards. We had the whole of the village, I think the whole of the village of Les Loges, which is the little hamlet that is closest to it. And we had this big ceremony on a gorgeous summer's day. And that, again, was a link, and the museum were really interested in championing that because it was some real history, and again, it was about the people and sharing that with the family members.
So there's not been a movie made of this, right?
Not yet. There's a British chap who's done some filming, hasn't he, Billy? I think for a documentary. Yeah, American, sorry.
So preparing a documentary for, I think, next year about the breakout on the fighting in Normandy. And he will speak in it about Operation Bluecoat.
Oh, nice. Okay, very cool. Keep us updated about that documentary. What is it? I'm going to ask you each the question. What is the one thing that you want people to be left with about Operation Bluecoat?
It's a human aspect of it. What happened to the people of it? For example, for some of them, the liberation of some village was the first time they met civilians, and they were welcomed like liberators. And also, for the objects they've left here in the museum, is something that are really important to us because each of them have a story, and it's a human story about them.
Okay.
And I think I would add, I would absolutely echo what Billy said there. And I think the only thing I would add is it's a far more important operation than a lot of history books would have us believe. Because a lot of history books either hardly mention it or don't mention its real significance. And it was a key operation. And I think the more people that are aware of that, the better.
Well, thank you both for keeping the stories alive and passing them down. And it's nice, like you said, the fresh face of Billy. He's obviously a younger man who knows how to do all the social media and all that. And, that's going to be a bridge to disseminating the information to younger people.
And it's the next generation being involved.
Yes. Right. And it's important. It's really important. So is there anything else that I didn't ask or that you want to say?
No, I think just thank you for the opportunity of us sharing the story that is normally shared with a few people, when they come and visit the museum and that, or sort of corner them in a bar and start talking to them about, my interest in that.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to both of you. Thank you so much for being here. I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks to you. Yeah.
There you have it, Colin Foster and Billy Leblond. To find out more about them, the museum, and Colin's blog, Men in the Shed, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.